I'm Jason with More 'n Handy, and this is part 4? I don't know. I need to go see what part it is. I'm Jason with More 'n Handy, and this is part 4 of the ultimate 75-gallon aquarium build. And in this video, I wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about this paint choice and this finish and how I achieved this antique look and how you can achieve the same look if you were painting at home and have it look like it was done by a professional. The colors that I've chosen were specifically chosen to match a handful of fish fossils that I found while on an expedition at the Green River Formation in Wyoming. I have a good number of fossils, and I'm thinking on displaying them on either side of the aquarium and maybe some on the wall up above. But ultimately, I wanted all these pieces to blend well together, and so these colors are going to help me achieve that. Before I get too far into my painting tips and techniques, I just want to say up front for the record, I am not a professional painter by any means. I probably have painted more than most people, including my fair share of cabinets and a few other things, but still, I'm definitely more of an amateur than a professional. But having said that, I have picked up a few tips and tricks over the years that I'm going to pass along in this video to anyone who might be trying to paint, particularly if you're having to paint with a paintbrush. The first thing that I want to say is that I have specifically chosen oak because I wanted the wood grain to show through the paint. But if you were looking for an ultra smooth finish, then oak is definitely not the wood that you're going to want to use. You might choose something like maple or poplar or some other species that has a closed grain, and you won't be able to see the wood grain through the paint. Get the finest bristle brush you can find. A super fine bristle brush is going to leave super fine brush marks, which are more likely to lay flat and be indistinguishable when the paint dries. Another thing that you might want to do if you're looking for a smooth finish is to use an oil-based paint. Now, I am using water-based because it does have its own set of advantages, but let me take a minute to talk about oil-based paint and why you might want to use it. Primarily, oil-based paint is just going to give you the smoothest possible finish when compared to water-based paints. And although water-based paints have come a long way in bridging that gap, there's still just no substitute for oil-based paint on a glossy, smooth finish. Oil-based paints are traditionally more durable, and in many ways, probably the best possible choice for an aquarium cabinet that's going to be periodically exposed to water. I have gone with a water-based paint mostly because I knew I was going to have to be painting this as time allowed, and I really wasn't going to be able to dedicate specific time just for painting. And that ultimately meant that I would need to be able to clean up easily and get everything going very quickly as well. Cleanup with oil-based paint is pretty much the most difficult cleanup of any paint that's out there. Oil-based paint also has a pretty strong odor. And lastly, oil-based paint tends to yellow a little bit with time, and for those reasons, I have chosen to use a water-based paint. Step number 1 is to buy a good paint. If you buy cheap paint, you really need to be prepared to have less than spectacular results. But assuming you've bought a good paint, you can also buy a paint conditioner. Paint conditioners extend the drying time of the paint, and that does a couple of different things. The first thing that it does is it allows it to absorb better into whatever material you're painting instead of having the wood dry the paint out prematurely. The second thing that it does is by simply extending the drying time of the paint, it also allows the paint to lay flatter before it begins to thicken and harden up. And of course, the byproduct of that is a smoother finish. I'll go ahead and say that it's still not quite as good of a finish as what you would get from oil paint, but to me it's worth the trade-off, knowing that I can clean up pretty easily and get started again pretty easily and have a paint job that looks as though it could have been done by a professional. Something else you should do when you're painting with any paint, water or oil-based, is to apply very thin coats. You hear that a lot among painting circles, but I think one of the things that's missing is the reason why. If you put the paint on very thick, it may look good when you're applying it, but it creates a situation where the paint takes forever to dry and may never dry at 100% fully. All paints, water-based or oil-based, have solvents within the paint that need to gas out as the paint dries. And if you apply the paint too thick, you end up with a sort of skin of dry paint on the surface holding in solvents underneath. And that more or less creates a situation where the paint never seems to fully harden or fully cure. It'll always feel tacky, and it'll be nearly impossible to sand it off and start over because every time you try to sand, you're just going to clog your sandpaper extremely quickly. So you'll almost have to use some sort of chemical to clean the paint off and start over. The bottom line is, stick to as thin of coats as you can manage, and you'll end up with a better looking paint job in the end. I think one of the most common mistakes that people make is to try to get everything in one complete coat. The biggest problem with that is that once paint comes into contact with the wood grain, some of that wood grain is going to stand up on end and it'll dry that way and create a very, very rough finish. So you're almost certainly going to have to sand that wood down back to a smooth finish and apply a second coat. As long as you're willing and prepared to apply as many as 2 or 3 coats, I think you're going to have a much better project than somebody who goes in and tries to just rush through it and get it done in one hit. Notice I'm mostly painting with the grain. Sometimes it is necessary on really deep open grain woods to paint against the grain for a stroke or two, just to be sure and push the paint down into the deepest grooves of that open wood grain. But after that, be sure you go back along with the grain and smooth that paint out. Otherwise, you'll end up with brush strokes that look unnatural on the painted surface. Okay, so now that I've had between 2 and 3 coats placed on pretty much every part of the stand and canopy, I'm going to move on to what I'm calling the antiquing of the furniture. The other thing I have is a slightly moistened paintbrush. I have the paint that's supposed to match the fish skeleton somewhat, and the aquarium stand itself is a pretty close match to the rock that the fossils were in. And so in order to begin the antiquing process, it's as simple as taking a little bit of the paint, putting it on the brush, and painting it into some of these darker cracks and crevices on the aquarium. And this paint dries fairly quickly, so you can't do a really large area at one time. You kind of have to take this in small chunks. And so now that I have this painted on, I will come back with a slightly moistened lint-free fabric. This is just an old cut-up shirt, and I will actually wipe this away. I'm being careful not to entirely clean the surface. All I really want to do is wipe away the majority and leave a little bit within the deeper cracks and crevices, and of course within the wood grain itself. Pretty much just like before, anytime I'm wiping the antiquing paint away, I want to be sure that I'm wiping along with the wood grain. One of the great things about doing this is that as one of your rags gets more and more used, it also allows you to kind of brush back on if you over wipe a little bit. And so don't throw these out until you're completely finished with the project. You want to be sure that your base coat has completely dried before you start doing this, because the reality is if it's not quite dry, you'll actually rub it off and damage the paint just a little bit. So make sure that you've given it several days to cure completely hard before you apply this glaze coat. And that just about wraps up the stand and canopy portion of this 75-gallon aquarium build, although there are some other extras that'll be coming off camera. The next video is going to showcase the electronics and the equipment that's going to operate this aquarium and how I'm going to organize those to keep them out of sight but also easy to access for maintenance and cleaning. And last of all, if you're enjoying this video or this series, a thumbs up and a subscribe is certainly appreciated. So until next time, this is Jason with Born Handy. Yes, I am painting again.
Daddy, can I help you?
Yes, you sure can. You give me just 1 minute to finish this, and then I will let you paint something.
What?
Okay?